Welcome to Design Nerds Anonymous, the podcast that sparks curiosity at the intersection of business and design. I'm your host, Amanda Schneider, founder and president at ThinkLab. Now, over the next few weeks, with the help of my fellow podcaster, Kaylin Reed from the Alternative Design Podcast with Kimball International, we'll be sharing nuanced insights around each of four vertical markets: corporate, education, healthcare, and hospitality. This is episode 2 of 4 in our current mini-season. Think of this like a prequel to season 6, which will release later this fall. In that season, we'll dig even deeper and offer more ideas, tools, and insights to help you fuel inspirational discussions within your project teams. So, let's get started. This episode is all about the education sector, specifically college and university planning and decisions. We've recently conducted 6 months of research with decision makers for the built environment, including education decision makers from Princeton, Texas Christian University, Georgia Institute of Technology, Rutgers, and my alma mater, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and many, many more. But what I'll say is, even if you're not in education, don't tune out just yet. There's so much cross-pollination to be done and so much to learn from what's happening in each of these different sectors. We saw it many times live during our in-person research sessions that happened earlier this year. But instead of telling you, let me show you. Here's one of our New York Live participants.
We're talking about this earlier at our tables during this design hackathon, that people understand now the value of drawing from a different discipline or a different sector, of learning from a different sector. I see the value of it more for our clients. Already residential was merging into workplace, healthcare was merging into hospitality. Processes in different groups can help and inform other groups. And I think people are looking to how healthcare works and, oh, wow, that's different than how financial sector works. What can we draw from that sector? There's so many things that are already crossing boundaries that I think clients are understanding that they can look to other sectors to inform themselves.
So what can we all learn from the education sector? Let's start with a little game of Would You Rather. This is a game that we played at each of our live sessions. Here we go. Would you rather A, know that pricing on your projects was going to double in the next year, or B, have hope that costs could rise or fall? Now, we'll share the final results of that Would You Rather game in our upcoming season of the podcast. But suffice to say that at the time of this recording, we understand from our participants that it is less about the cost and more about the volatility. And that's actually the biggest issue right now. Most would rather know that pricing was going to double, so it would avoid all of that rework, than have hope that it could stay the same or fall because of all of these unknowns and the rework that causes. In fact, about 58% of all of our end users said that cost was the number one thing that was really changing their decision-making process today. When we asked our education-based research participants to share one word that describes how the decision-making process has changed, you'll hear this theme come through in many of their responses.
Shock. My word is shock. Prices have gone up so much. A lot of my time is managing expectations about how much pricing has increased.
My word is focus. We go through a whole design process, and then the project gets paused for a long time due to funding constraints. During that time, we have to stay focused on the end goal to move through the process.
My one word is clarity. We've had a lot of leadership changes in the past few years, and funding and championing for the built environment sometimes just goes with them. My constant struggle is finding clarity to know that we're working on the right things for this environment.
Hi, good afternoon. The word I would use to describe change to our process today is deliberate. It's because we have to be more deliberate than ever about how we manage, how we spend our money, and how we downright have to be methodical about what we choose to do and what we choose not to do.
Hi, I actually have 2 words: budget expectations. There are a lot of big ideas thrown out, but not a lot of funding to make those ideas happen, so it can be stopped and started.
Oh, my word is for sure budget. So project costs have changed. We aren't doing quite as much, but we are spending more on one project instead of doing two.
All right, to summarize, we heard shock, focus, clarity, deliberate, and lots about budgets. We heard that they are more deliberate than ever about how they spend money, more methodical about what they choose to do, and maybe more importantly, what they choose not to do. This is making it harder than ever to corral their constituents to consensus. Now, in our research, it seems that higher ed of all the sectors feels the most caught in the middle between two not-so-hidden culprits, often orchestrating workarounds to navigate the realities of their institutions. So what are those culprits? They are rising costs and the rising number of decision makers. Our beloved decision makers within these colleges and universities are managing the design firm, they're managing their customer, technically, who will be using the space, while also dealing with churning leadership that often doesn't have the same background as many of us that grew up in this industry to understand the depth of these spatial decisions. To boot, decision-making in this sector is also the most bureaucratic. By consequence, many have become what we'll call forcibly scrappy. They use tactics like opaque transparency, which you'll hear about later, to get around decision by committee. Many of them are now hiring internal estimators to navigate some of these cost challenges that we talked about, and trying to bring construction earlier in than ever to pave the way for some of these workarounds. We know that last year, inflation soared to near historic highs, creating rising operational costs for many colleges and universities. Now, inflation has leveled off, but the higher education sector is still being squeezed by the lingering effects of elevated costs and ongoing supply chain issues. As a result, many institutions are seeing campus construction projects run over budget and behind schedule. Developments planned years ago when the economy was less volatile suddenly cost more in this environment. A recent poll of live audience members attending a panel on operating in an inflationary environment at the annual conference of the National Association of College and University Business Officers found that of 151 live respondents, 64% said that their institution had delayed or canceled projects as a result of added cost pressures. Only 15% indicated no major changes to capital planning. And not everything is negative. Here's an excerpt from an anonymous interviewee who attended our New York event. You'll hear her several times throughout this episode. When asked for one word to describe how the process has changed, here's what she said.
More organized. Before the pandemic, there was not as much coordination between the different departments working from home and remotely, and a lot of our departments actually couldn't do that because they're carpenters, they're operations and maintenance. But I think because a lot of the other staff were working from home, it really fostered the need for a lot of cross communication between the different groups. And that really has been a lot of development within our departments to create more connection and streamline different processes that way.
So let's look at where in the project process is the most painful. At ThinkLab, we believe where there's pain, there's opportunity. And our talented data visualizers at ThinkLab, shout out to Tana, created a heat map that shows where each vertical is feeling the most pain. The more intense the color, the more consolidated the pain is. Higher ed experienced the most pain in the first two process blocks, the first one being internal planning, and the second one being the design process. Here are 3 reasons why. Number 1, back to that cost issue, rising costs are causing rework.
We are still growing back into the pre-COVID amount of construction projects that were going on. Budget always drives our projects. We are not at the luxury of saying, oh, we'll just add more money. No, the budget is the budget, and that is it. So it has made it more difficult, even on contract. Things have doubled what they used to cost.
With the increase in contract pricing, which has historically been the best deal, this anonymous institution is looking at shifting their entire procurement process to leverage their buying power in new ways.
As a public university, we purchase using buying contracts. We use those so we don't have to go out to public bids all the time. One of the things our procurement group is doing is different ways that they could develop their own procurement packages, contracts, dedicated contracts with different manufacturers. Could we say we have this amount of purchasing power, and we have a considerable amount of purchasing power on this specific type of furniture? Could we do a bid that would then say, this manufacturer is great, we're going to use this for all office furniture? A lot of our buildings, were done 50, 60, 70 years ago. There's a lot of dated buildings out there that are in serious need of updating. And I'm not just talking, I'm certainly the labs and the research and the science areas. They're just, the structure in the building is just not meeting what the needs are for current day standards and codes. So if we could foster that buying power for all those hopefully upcoming projects, would be really beneficial to the university.
We heard a lot about pain in the design process for higher education because these uncomfortable pricing discoveries, but that brings us back to our comments around cost, shock, and budget. Projects were budgeted for when things cost much less. So now, many internal teams are struggling to manage stakeholder expectations and explain these changes in costs. Here's one of our hotline callers.
Program changes are now happening in design development and construction documentation phases when they should have been decided in internal planning. Also, pre-construction isn't engaged early enough in the process, so we often have to pivot much later than we'd like.
Number 2, more decision makers than ever. We'd say equally painful, if not louder than the cost issues, was the evolution in decision makers. And while this may not be new, it has certainly intensified in recent years. We heard quotes like this.
For higher ed, it's a funding issue and a consensus issue. Most universities are consensus driven, so it's productive, but it involves a lot of time and commitment. Because most universities are trying to retain faculty, they feel the need to involve them in decisions. And then you throw in another different layer when you add in student input. So now they have to merge different generations and perspectives outside of just what faculty wants.
It's no longer just one person at the top saying, this is what we're going to do. So with more decision makers, we also have more complexity.
Zoom has enabled more people to be at the table.
We're very strategic about who we include. We're private, so that helps. But there's a fine line between collaboration and engaging with too many. We are deliberate with every decision and every process that we look at.
One research participant who asked not to be identified by name or voice shared the idea of opaque transparency to combat this need for consensus. And what he meant by this was show the increasingly broadening decision committee limited options that are absolutely needed to move forward, and only those options needed to move forward. It feels like transparency to them, but you're keeping much of the complexity opaque that may overwhelm them or delay a decision. Thus, opaque transparency. All right, number 3, they need more data. 22%, the highest of any other sector in our survey, said that education end users are doing more research on their own before the project starts. Let's find out why.
I would say to look more for information that can help the project in the beginning. The research-based, not just from personal experience, but to really look outside your industry as well, and what information is out there to really support the decision that you're making.
If I include research or evidence in my project presentations, it definitely speeds up the project decision-making process.
Several mention undergoing new instructional master planning efforts to make sure classrooms meet quantity and teaching pedagogy styles. However, much like the corporate sector that we heard about last week, and if you haven't listened, I would encourage you to go back and listen to last week's episode, they're having a hard time implementing new collaborative ways of teaching with the same square foot per person. Because when it's reconfigured in an existing room footprint, it dramatically decreases or at least changes the number of seats. So today, there's not a clear standard, and it requires more alignment with master planning, staff, and students than ever.
I attended a seminar where they did an internal research asking new students or incoming freshmen what were their concerns, what were their fears, what did they like, what were they looking for, what were their majors. And it was really eye-opening to see the responses to those kinds of questions. And I think the information that I got from that will really help me as I'm designing spaces for the next project. I think specifically directed towards faculty administrative departments so that how could they better their learning, the structure of their learning, develop programs that would engage students in all different ways. Yeah. This wasn't directly specifically for design, it was, but certainly related because we want to support those projects, those spaces, learning.
All right, so I want to give a big thank you to all of our interviewees in this episode who put the anonymous in Design Nerds Anonymous, as well as our hotline callers. Now that we all have this collective perspective and understanding, in the second half of this episode, we're going to give you context, ideas, and insight as to how we might collectively help solve these challenges. So with that, I'm pleased to bring back my co-host, Kaylin, who's going to give us a bit more perspective on this sector.
Hi, listeners. This is Kaylin Reed, and I'm a design futurist at Kimball International and the host of the Alternative Design Podcast. Amanda invited me on the show to help draw some parallels between ThinkLab's latest hackathon results on the future of customer decision-making and what we're seeing more broadly in these sectors. As a foresight practitioner, my job is to look for data and trends that are happening in the design industry and beyond that spark uncertainties about our future. I dive into those uncertainties to identify future possibilities, or what we call scenarios. From there, we can actually begin to establish potential threats and opportunities that can help guide today's decision-making for tomorrow's reality. We do this and much more on the Alternative Design Podcast, which you should totally check out after listening to this episode. We just wrapped an entire season on the future of education. So far, we've identified that cost volatility is majorly impacting decision-making today within education, whether due to supply chain issues, inflation, or just lack of funding. And it comes at a moment of extreme pressure. We know enrollment rates for higher education are, on the whole, declining, though this is impacting regions differently. And it's creating an extremely competitive landscape as institutions compete for students. Some universities are installing lazy rivers and lavish amenities to attract and retain students, leaving others, especially those with funding challenges, looking for alternative ways to create value. And speaking of value, even with strong data supporting that a college degree is a major influencer of career success, we as a society are wrestling with the value of higher education as more and more states remove degrees as barriers of entry to government jobs, and companies are seemingly overlooking that traditional requirement. But as we discussed in the last episode on workplace, we're entering an era where education is a critical need for everyone, not just Gen Z or Gen Alpha, as we adapt to new technologies like AI. So at the intersection of these trends lies some potential uncertainties about the future of learning environments and the decision-making that will influence them. How might alternative revenue streams, policy changes, or even new partnerships change how universities are funded in the future? How will the college experience evolve in a future that's increasingly hybrid and more personalized to the learner? What does learning beyond the campus look like? This episode opened with a participant commenting on the increasing value recognition of looking at other industries for inspiration. What we're seeing in healthcare is that Many systems are decentralizing their care models, partnering with retail as a front door to patient experience. More patients are wanting convenience and access to easy care. So, why do I say this? Well, what if we thought about healthcare and what's going on there in the context of the education sector? What if learning or upskilling, a word you'll for sure be hearing more and more companies use frequently, what if that was as easy as walking into a retail store or a coffee shop? In our latest season of the Alternative Design podcast, we explored how new company and university partnerships could emerge as businesses look to build talent funnels and institutions look for new funding and sponsorships. We could see an example of this in the form of university-sponsored learning environments in the workplace, or in retail, or even in third places. We could also see companies leverage campus student centers or libraries to upskill their employees. Additionally, we might see some private institutions, rather than relying mostly on tuition fees, go to a subscription-based model. Learning in this example is lifelong, and so universities could capitalize on new forms of education delivery to potentially a new demographic of learners in a way that's convenient and ongoing and is just part of your monthly bills. How do these potential scenarios translate to space, and what does that mean for you now? Well, the changing societal perception of higher ed could mean that formal learning will happen in more places than just on campus. But don't count universities out of this future just yet, because they could position themselves as the key player making this happen. We could also see decision-making being more heavily influenced by corporations who are willing to partner with universities to basically grow their own talent pool for potential employment. Think about the buying power of a major university and a major corporation combining. Some companies may want to leverage campus facilities for upskilling or for large team gatherings across their distributed workforce. In short, traditionally non-learning environments may suddenly need to support someone earning a micro-credential on their lunch. And campus designers may need to think about how facilities can support the design needs of the corporate sector, whether that's in a flex space that can be multi-purpose or space that the university just leases out to businesses. But let's get back to the present, because there's some outstanding practical takeaways that you can start implementing right now to capitalize on future opportunities in the education sector.
I always love Kaylin's perspective. So much so that for the final section of this episode, I've invited her back to join me in a dialogue to help all of us digest some of the fantastic ideas that we've gathered as part of this research. So one of our goals is that every episode this season follows our own advice with insights, but not just those insights, really the context synthesis and storytelling. So in this final section, Kaylin and I are going to cover the so what. You're going to hear us banter with ideas. So whether you're a decision maker and listening for the group therapy aspects of this, maybe you're a service provider like an A&D firm or commercial real estate firm trying to better serve your clients, or even a manufacturer rep or dealer distributor trying to be a better partner, our hope is that we can walk you through some of these tangible ideas. And I want to emphasize that these ideas were not from Kaylin and I, although we're going to be riffing on them here. This is really coming from this hackathon research that Kimball International was a partner with. And these are ideas generated from cross-functional groups of end users, commercial real estate, developers, A&D, product manufacturers, distributors across Chicago, Atlanta, and New York. And some of them also came from the group therapy piece of this, which was these private sections with all of these end users, specifically in the education sector. So let's dive into our 3 ideas here, starting with number 1 is be their bookmark. Now, this came directly from our education session, where we had a bunch of our education end users that are really the decision makers, a key point of contact for these colleges and universities. And they were really keen on this idea of past, present, and future thinking. Basically, they often work with partners and they are managing a lot of different projects. So they really want their partners to help them put whatever current project is going on in context and help them share it out. A direct quote from one of these end users was, if a project partner can effectively communicate where we've been and where we're going with the users, it's extremely powerful. It helps us remember where we were last time in a linear and sometimes very drawn out process, because it really helps us get that context for our decision making.
First of all, you know how I feel about future thinking. When you say past, present, future, I get really excited.
You're into the future.
So
Let's go.
I'm into the future there. Something that is going to be increasingly helpful to help these decision makers is understanding who the future learner is in these education environments. We think of a traditional student as that 18 to 21 age range. And so you hear a lot about Gen Z and Gen Alpha. You just wrapped a phenomenal season of DNA that goes into that really deep dive of Gen Z and what they want. But what we found in our latest season of alternative design is that this, definition of learner is expanding. So getting back to what you mean in terms of providing context, understanding the future learner and that expanded definition of what the learner is going to be increasingly helpful. What we're seeing is that because the workforce, this goes back to corporate a little bit, is shifting and changing, and AI is going to change these different roles and responsibilities, people need to upskill. And so people are actually needing to learn at any age. We're talking about folks in their 30s and their 40s, those that are in the twilight of their career are having to relearn stuff because of the volatility of the workforce in general right now. I read a stat recently that by 2030, a third of jobs will actually need to be reimagined and rethought through because AI is going to change them so drastically. So thinking about what the future learner is and how they're going to experience space, like what does a person in their 30s or 40s need in a learning environment versus someone in that traditional 18 to 21 age range? If we can be offering design solutions that capture and cater to a broader definition of learner, I think that's going to be really helpful for these education decision makers, just to be able to understand some of these future shifts that are going to be taking place. There's a synergy between education and corporate, at least that's what we have found. One sort of follows the other. Think about what are the tried and true workplace solutions that we can maybe integrate into student and learning environments to help and hopefully offer an inspiring, expanded solution for these folks.
Mm-hmm. I knew you were going to dive into that futurist section, but I'm going to push us back a little bit because I think something you said about the future really makes me think about that past and present thinking as well, which is as manufacturers, especially our dealer partners, definitely our A&D partners that are working with these education sectors. All of these folks have incredible views into many projects in these sectors and how they've gone, and to be able to aggregate best practices. And then there's one step further, which is also aggregating that specific clients, especially if they have the history, to be able to say, this is what's happened, this is where we are, any way that you can be the keeper of that past, present, future bookmark. Let's move on to our second one here, which is share new insights in a way that they can share them. We heard that these institutions are really hungry for research. One institution even talked about some student research that was being done, not by the architecture and design team internally for that university, by another department, and they stumbled upon it. They didn't even know it was happening. They stumbled upon it and how valuable and useful it was to really look at the spaces that they design. And I know many manufacturers are already doing some of this research so they can be ready with the products that are available. On your latest season of the Alternative Design Podcast, you're certainly diving deep into this education sector. So talk a little bit about opportunities to incorporate some of this student perspective, because often our client teams, what we're hearing is they don't have time to get as deep as they would like. So this is an opportunity for any of our product or service partners to really be a resource for them.
This goes back to what you were saying before in terms of being the past, present, future bookmark, understanding what is the value of the data that you have. We have a history of projects at a high level view. And my suggestion would be to look at those projects, and even ones that maybe aren't checkboxed as education projects. How can we bridge the insights that we've learned from, say, a hospitality project or a workplace project or a healthcare project even, something that maybe isn't in that siloed sector, but has that transferable opportunity to really see that this past project, while it was hospitality, has an increasingly relevant implication for learning environments. So I think we're going to have to be doing a lot more synthesis and a lot more analysis, really thinking about these spaces differently. Bringing those nuggets of information to these education environments is going to really help, especially as we see more sectors and more verticals being integrated into education spaces. I was recently talking to a friend of mine, and she was mentioning that they're incorporating retail spaces into learning environments. Designers are expected, and decision makers at these tables are expected to have more broad information. We've chatted about this before, Amanda, that I versus T knowledge, if you want to talk about that for just a moment.
Yeah, let me explain that one. So this is the idea of the workforce of the future is going to have to be T-based, not I-based. And I think I-based is basically a specialist in one field. So you go really deep, just like the letter I. And the idea of T-shaped development is where you have that deep expertise, just like the bottom of the T, but you also have broad expertise, kind of shallow knowledge, just like the top of that T, broad knowledge of a variety of other sectors that allows you to apply your deep bottom of the T base to those other sectors. That's going to be really key for the future, not only of the workforce, but probably of this industry to really help cross-pollinate as we're figuring out what's next with physical space here. This brings us perfectly to our third and final idea. The third one is be a hero maker, not a hero. If you listened to last week's episode on Culprit, we talked about managing up and making things easy to share, but education is looking for this as well. We recognize that many times your champion within those education environments are likely juggling multiple priorities. We often want to be the hero. We want to be so useful to them to get their project to consensus. But really the best way to do that today is being able to share information that is easily shareable with more decision makers than ever. It's really important to think a bit about the format and how they don't have to spend a lot of time understanding spontaneous combustion and then explaining it to their peers or superiors. It's just as simple as putting a key in an engine and turning the key so they can go.
I absolutely agree. We really need to make sure that we're creating simplified information that can be shared broadly. How are you delivering thought leadership and insights to really become that consultative seller and really understand the changes that this environment is undergoing to make sure that you're positioning the most adaptable solution?
We're hearing with different pedagogy that's happening in the education environment where it used to be maybe a simpler solution. As soon as you start rearranging those classrooms with flexible furniture, or they're leveraging new teaching styles that aren't just lecture based, I think they're finding some of the same utilization challenges. So maybe there are opportunities to learn from some of what we talked about in the corporate sector and bring it to education as well.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for this episode, folks. But we don't want the launch of this mini season to be the end, rather the beginning. So if you're a decision maker in the higher education sector, or if you frequently work on projects in this sector, we would love to hear from you. What have we missed in this episode? If this sparked something for you, please call our hotline at 917-934-2942 and leave us a message. We'll also throw that number in the show notes. We're preparing for season 6, and you may just find your voicemail included. Stay tuned next week for our episode on the paradox of an unrushable process in fast times. You guessed it, it's the health and wellness sector. Our goal with this mini season is cross-pollination. So again, even if you don't work in this sector, rest assured there will be something in this episode for you. We'll talk to you next week. This episode of Design Nerds Anonymous was produced and edited by Sandow Design Group. Special thanks to Hannah Vitti. Design Nerds Anonymous is a proud member of the Surround Podcast Network. Discover more shows from Surround at surroundpodcast.com.